Well, I think we're going to begin. I understand that there were some long lines to try to get into the Capitol here today, so I think there will be others that will be coming in. But I want to wish everybody good morning. I want to welcome you. And I want to apologize for having to reschedule this hearing once because of something called a government shutdown that kind of messed everything up. And today is the day that our colleague, our beloved colleague, Bill Young from Florida, is having a funeral mass. So they gave away votes today, and a number of my colleagues are in Florida to pay the tributes to Congressman Young. But we thought it was important not to reschedule it again. This is an important issue, and we wanted to be able to get some things on the record. I also want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement that was provided to us by the Colombian Embassy. We are grateful for that, and that will be made public. And I again thank you for attending this important hearing on pathways to creating peace and justice in Colombia. I want to thank Katya Megacheva and the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for organizing this hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses, some of who have traveled from Colombia to be with us here this morning, for testifying and for everything they do to promote and protect human rights in Colombia. Each of you, in different capacities, has worked to improve a very difficult state of affairs in Colombia and possess valuable insights into the urgent issues of today. Over the past 12 years, I've traveled 8 times to Colombia. Most recently, Congressman George Miller and I spent a week in Colombia at the end of August, reviewing the status of labor rights and key human rights issues as part of a delegation sponsored by the Washington Office on Latin America. Because of my long involvement with Colombia, I have come to love and admire its people, whose courage and compassion can only inspire hope in Colombia's future. Every time I go to Colombia, I return excited by Colombia's incredible potential for greatness and change, and deeply disturbed by the continuing violence and hardship that characterize daily life for too many Colombians, especially those who live in rural Colombia or marginalized urban settings, or who advocate for human rights and social justice. We all know the statistics because Colombians themselves have documented their reality so well. A half-century of conflict has claimed more than 220,000 lives, and even while the country struggles to negotiate an end to the war, the number of victims continues to climb. Human rights activists in Colombia experience grave danger from a variety of sources: rebels, paramilitaries, powerful vested interests, and even some state powers. People trying to return to their land under President Santos' landmark victims in land restitution law face threats, abuse, violence, and even death. And against the backdrop of ongoing peace negotiations, Colombia struggles to create a system of transitional justice that would allow the war to end and help heal society's deep wounds. It seems to me that we have plenty to talk about today. Under the Santos government, we have seen Colombia unveil several initiatives, which, if fully and faithfully implemented, could address some of its most difficult problems. First is President Santos' historic Victims in Land Restitution Law, signed in 2011. Another is the U.S.-Colombia Labor Action Plan, signed by Presidents Obama and Santos in April 2011, which was needed for the successful passage of the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. In addition, the Santos administration sponsored and the Colombian Congress approved 2 major but problematic laws that affect how Colombia will address justice and human rights now and in the future, namely the Framework for Peace and the changes to the jurisdiction of military justice known as the Fuero Militar. Last night, the Colombian Constitutional Court struck down this law on procedural grounds, and we will have to watch over the coming days what path the government chooses to follow regarding this controversial matter. And finally, this leads me to one of the most important and courageous initiatives underway in Colombia, the ongoing negotiations between the government and the FARC to end 50 years of conflict and secure a just and lasting peace. Each of these initiatives seeks to address historic wrongs that have resulted in violence, major human rights crimes, and humanitarian crises. Each faces daunting challenges, and each raises new questions about how Colombia will address peace, justice, respect for human rights, reparations for victims of violence, development, equity, and reconciliation. Many promises have been made or implied, but the proof is in how these initiatives move forward, and how they are implemented, and whether they change for the better the reality on the ground, especially for those who have been the victims of violence, historic prejudice, and discrimination. Now, having just returned from a fact-finding trip looking at labor rights, I can say with some confidence that there is a great distance between the promises made under the Labor Action Plan, the rhetoric employed by both the United States and Colombian governments, and the difficult and often violent reality that daily confronts so many Colombian workers. The same can be said for land rights advocates and victims' rights advocates who face increased threats and violence as the victims and land restitution law is applied over the next decade. And the same is true for Colombia's most vulnerable populations, in particular its diverse indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombian communities. I would like to announce that last night the government of Colombia and the thousands of indigenous peoples who have been protesting over the past week also reached a historic agreement. I want to express my appreciation to the indigenous leaders and the Minister of Interior for reaching this agreement. I especially want to mention the important roles played by the Colombian Human Rights Ombudsman and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights representative in Colombia for their role in helping reduce tensions and mediate and facilitate these negotiations that have resulted in these accords. For those who have been following this situation, it is my understanding that the 7 law enforcement officers held by the Minga and the 34 indigenous protesters who were held by the police have all been released. I've never met a Colombian who doesn't long for peace. But peace, let alone a just and lasting peace, is never easy. Reconciliation is not easy, and its success will rely on the very individuals and communities that have been most victimized by the war and violence. Quite frankly, war and violence are easy. Ending them with the FARC and ultimately with the ELN are essential to Colombia's prosperity and development. But development, prosperity, and yes, peace will remain elusive as long as the neo-paramilitaries, criminal networks, invested local and regional interests that they benefit continue to flourish and exert de facto control over large areas of Colombia through violence and the threat of violence. I believe that one day we will see a more peaceful, socially just, strong Colombia. But I caution that now is not the time for half measures, for symbolic laws, and unfulfilled promises. Now is the time to come together, to think creatively and think out of the box, and to act affirmatively so that that day arrives sooner rather than later. I would I'd now like to turn to our first witness. And again, as I said, I want to submit for the record any other written testimonies that have been provided by our witnesses, and I will submit the statement by the Colombian government on the human rights challenges facing their country. I'll also ask for unanimous consent to submit a letter from the U.S. religious leaders in support of the peace process, a statement from Colombian Congressman Wilson Arias Castillo, and a statement by Dr. Gabe Tews, Policy Director of the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues. I would like to note that Dr. Tews received his Ph.D. at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I am from, and for those of you who are interested in a little bit of trivial pursuit, that is the only college or university in the United States that Sigmund Freud lectured at. So I don't know whether he had a bad experience and didn't want to come back and lecture anymore, but that's the only place he lectured. So it is now my pleasure to welcome our first witness, Mr. William Duncan, the Director of Andean Affairs at the Bureau of Western Hemisphere at the United States State Department. Welcome.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before this distinguished commission today. In the 13 years since the United States began supporting Plan Colombia and subsequent initiatives, Colombia has indeed made significant advances on security, the fight against illicit drugs, and protecting human rights. Between 2002 and 2012, Colombia saw an 89% reduction in kidnappings, an 84% reduction in political assassinations, a 48% reduction in homicides, and just since 2007, Colombia saw a 53% drop in coca cultivation, now the lowest since 1996. In the past year alone, the Colombian government officially launched a peace process with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, supported efforts to vigorously combat corruption, and began issuing land restitution decisions under the new victims law. Additionally, since taking office, President Santos created a national development plan that for the first time contains a chapter on human rights, dismantled the abusive Administrative Department of Security, or DAS, and consolidated multiple protection programs into a national protection unit. These successes are significant, and yet Colombia has plenty of work left to do. As Vice President Angelino Garzón stated in Geneva at the United Nations Universal Periodic Review of Colombia in April, Colombia recognizes that it still has to overcome tremendous challenges, in particular those that relate to the fight against members of illegal armed groups and guerrillas, criminal gangs, drug traffickers, and common criminals. At the Universal Periodic Review, the United States and the world shared concerns with Colombia regarding its human rights situation. Colombia accepted the vast majority of the recommendations made there. The United States continues to support Colombia as it tackles these human rights challenges. Among the challenges facing Colombia are threats to and violence against labor activists and unionists and obstacles to effectively protecting internationally recognized labor rights. With this in mind, the United States and Colombia jointly agreed to the action plan related to labor rights in April of 2012. The United States, via the Departments of State, Justice, and Labor, has provided assistance to improve the capabilities of justice sector personnel and promote compliance with international labor standards. Since 2011, Colombia has enhanced enforcement of labor laws and regulations. The Ministry of Labor has increased the number of inspectors, assessed major fines, and begun implementing a new law to increase formalization of workers. Though even one murder is one too many, we are encouraged that homicides of trained unionists have declined from 193 in 2001 to 20 in 2012, according to statistics from the National Union School. While these are important developments, other results on labor issues are mixed. None of the assessed major fines has been collected. It is our understanding that there have been no successful prosecutions or convictions in trade unionist homicide cases in the past 2 years. The number of threats to union members and leaders has increased, and the Ministry of Labor inspectors working to more stringently apply labor laws have also been threatened. None of the perpetrators of those threats has been brought to justice. We engage closely with the government and civil society on these issues, and we have found Minister of Labor Pardo to be an open and responsive counterpart. We will continue to work with all stakeholders to help ensure that Colombia fully upholds its clear commitment to protect internationally recognized labor rights, prevent violence against labor leaders, and prosecute the perpetrators of such violence. In addition to addressing ongoing concerns, we are supporting Colombia's efforts to prepare for a better future. As Secretary Kerry said during his August visit, President Santos has undertaken a very courageous and very necessary and very imaginative effort to seek a political solution to one of the world's longest conflicts. The United States welcomes and supports a peace that promotes respect for rule of law and human rights. One key element to building peace is addressing the legacy of decades of conflict. President Santos' Victims Law is an ambitious effort in that regard. As you might expect, with so many people affected, implementation has been a tremendous challenge. According to the Victims Unit website, the government has registered 5.8 million victims. We recognize the logistical, administrative, and security challenges involved in assessing and rendering judgment in these cases, but delays have been substantial. According to a July report by the Historical Memory Group, land restitution judges have granted restitution in only 1% of the 31,111 claims received under the Victims Law. To support Colombia's efforts in implementation of the Victims Law, USAID has a $50 million project to provide technical assistance. This funding covers the first 3 years of the implementation of the Victims Law to help ensure that effective institutions, policies, and systems at all levels, national, departmental, and municipal, are established and operational. In addition to helping the victims, concluding a peace agreement is another daunting challenge with human rights implications. The government's legal framework for peace law, recently found constitutional by the Constitutional Court, is the strategy to allow Colombians the ability to both secure justice for human rights violators and reach a peace agreement that can end the killing. There are tensions involved in this effort, but it is not a zero-sum game. These are all challenges Colombia will need to work through, but we stand by Colombia as a friend, and we too are optimistic. President Biden said to the people of Colombia during his May visit, "You've reclaimed your nation from civil war. You've taken this country further and faster than many dared hope." The United States supports Colombia's efforts to ensure accountability and to protect those who are working to make Colombia a more peaceful, democratic, and secure state. Thank you, and I would be happy to try and answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, and we're joined by Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici of Oregon, and happy that she is here with us today. Let me begin with just a few questions. First, about the peace process. In general, what is your assessment of the prospects for these peace talks, and what does the United States government believe it can do to improve the prospects of peace in Colombia? If a peace deal is signed with the leftist rebels, do you anticipate that U.S. assistance to Colombia might change? And if so, how?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. As we have said on many occasions, we welcome and support the efforts by President Santos and the Colombian people to find the peace and security that I think we all agree they deserve. We also hope the FARC will take this opportunity to put an end to its acts of terrorism and narcotics trafficking. However, as you know, we are not parties to these negotiations, and therefore we have tried not to take public positions on the various negotiating points on which the parties are discussing. With respect to your question regarding preparations to support the implementation of an eventual peace accord, Secretary Kerry said when he was in Colombia in August that it's not for the United States to make that sort of decision at this moment while the negotiations are underway, that would be an insult to the sovereignty of the Colombian government and inappropriate in the context of this process. However, we have also made it clear that once peace is achieved, the United States will be prepared to enter into those sorts of conversations and to try to do everything in our power to support the implementations of those accords, whatever form they may take.
And I want to challenge Secretary Kerry, who's from my home state, who I admire and think is brilliant on everything. But the reason why I asked the question is because it seems to me that I mean there are all kinds of issues that are going to have to be addressed if there is a peace accord. One, making sure that the FARC and then ultimately the ELN comply and that there are verification procedures put in place. But the one kind of concern that a lot of us have who kind of observed Colombia over the years is whether or not the military as an institution will actually comply. And given the fact that the United States has been such a huge supporter of the Colombian military, it would seem to me that, and this would not be interfering with the negotiations, but it would seem to me that it'd be important to signal that if there is a peace agreement, that we're prepared to kind of change the kind of aid that we're providing, one that transitions more military into civilian life, and again less kind of the traditional military aid that we're providing to help them fight a war. And and I think that there are some people in the military, not everybody, but some that are going to need a little bit more convincing than others. And I think that we are in a unique situation to be able to have some significant influence on some of those who might believe that they don't have to comply. So I mean that's why I kind of asked the question, and I hope that we're communicating to the Colombian military that if in fact there is a peace agreement negotiated between the government and the FARC and the ELN, that we intend to support that agreement, and that we will certainly not be providing assistance to people who do not comply with that agreement.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I agree with you, and I think because we have made it clear that we support the process and that we will stand ready to support the implementation, I hope that message is being received. Certainly, human rights for a very long time has been a central part of our conversations with the Colombian military, and we've been deeply involved in trying to assist them in improving their ability, their respect for human rights. And I would also note that in recent years, in terms of our assistance request and in terms of what Congress has approved, you have begun to see a shift from the security and counter-narcotics assistance moving more towards the consolidation assistance, alternative development, and those sorts of things. To some extent, that process has already begun, and I would anticipate that with the coming of peace accords, we would see that begin to accelerate.
As I mentioned in my opening statement, I visited Colombia with Congressman Miller, looking pretty closely at the labor rights situation, and we were trying to get an assessment for whether the labor action plan that was signed by both the United States and Colombian presidents, whether in fact it was being implemented. And I just have to tell you in all candor that I think both Congressman Miller and I, while very heartened by the intent of the Labor Action Plan and by the words of all of the Colombian government officials that we met with who said that they want to see this implemented properly, I think we came away pretty shocked, quite frankly, that the situation was quite dire. That labor rights activists and organizers continue to be under threat. Workers' rights continue to be disrespected. That some of the employers find ways to go around some of the stated intent of the Colombian government, and that for a lot of workers, things have actually deteriorated. And does the United States carry any responsibility for the successful implementation of this plan? And I ask that question because I think I didn't support the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, but I know a lot of people that did so because of that Labor Action Plan, because they thought this was going to be something that was going to make a real difference. And Congressman Miller and I are working on trying to put some of our thoughts in writing in terms of a report, which we'll provide to you. But the situation is really troubling, and I'd just like to get your assessment on what you think.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we would certainly look forward to seeing you and Congressman Miller's report. As I indicated in my statement, I do think it's fair to recognize that since the signing of the Labor Action Plan, there have been important steps made. The creation of the new Ministry of Labor, the appointment of a minister who we think is genuinely committed to doing the right thing on these issues, the increase in the number of inspectors, the significant drop over time in the number of trade unionists who have been killed. Again, one is one too many, but it has been a downward trend over the last several years. Having said that, we would certainly agree with you that there are significant challenges that remain. There needs to be more done in the area of actually pursuing these cases against people who have killed labor activists, people who are continuing to threaten labor activists. So there's a prosecutorial job to be done there. There continue to be concerns, and I know you saw this during your visit, with these various mechanisms for hiring that in some cases lend themselves to employers evading internationally recognized labor rights. Colombia has done some work to close up the loopholes with respect to the cooperatives. Now there are concerns about these so-called limited liability or SAS corporations. So I think I would say that the Labor Action Plan was an important inflection point in terms of our bilateral cooperation about the importance of respecting labor rights. Colombia has done a good job of implementing the milestones in that Labor Action Plan. However, protecting labor rights is not something you do once and then you're done. It's a continuing process. It's something you have to keep paying attention to over time. And to answer one of your specific questions, we certainly think we have a continuing responsibility going forward to engage them, and we will do that.
Yeah, and let me just again say, I mean, I want to recognize the kind of the institutional progress. I think the fact that this kind of an agreement was signed, the fact that the Colombian government says publicly that they want to see it implemented fully and faithfully. That's all very good. But on the ground, it's a very serious situation. And that's kind of what we have seen, not only on the Labor Action Plan, but on the Land Restitution Act as well. I mean, you know, on one hand, you have everybody at the top saying that this is a good idea and that we ought to move forward. But then when you go on the ground, especially when you kind of get out to some of these smaller villages, it is very, very serious. And we will get you that. We're going to work on the report. We will get it to you. And I don't want to diminish the importance of what President Santos has said and what the ministers have said. But what we have seen on the ground, is very, very troubling. And I think it is important that the United States obviously be a strong partner with not only the Colombian government, but with the human rights organizations and the labor leaders to make sure this is done right. Because in terms of trade agreements, I mean, if you get this right in Colombia, but it could actually be a model for other trade agreements. But in any event, I appreciate it. Let me yield to my colleague, Congresswoman Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing to raise awareness and give us updates on this very important topic. And I wanted to follow up on what you were asking, Mr. Chairman, about the Labor Action Plan. Although I was not here at the time that the Colombia Free Trade Agreement passed, I'm very much aware of the Labor Action Plan and the importance of having those labor protections as in place as part of the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And I wanted to follow up because it's my understanding that, and as you said, there has been progress made under the Labor Action Plan. But it's my understanding that some of the implementation issues have been because of a lack of cooperation from the business community and the business sector. And I wanted to talk about what efforts are being made from that regard. If the business community and the economy are in fact benefiting from the free trade agreement, what efforts are being made with the business community to try to emphasize to them the importance of this Labor Action Plan?
Thank you, Congresswoman. That's an excellent question. As I suspect you know, the original plan was for my Department of Labor colleagues to be here with me today, and I think they've explained to the staff why they couldn't do that, had to do with the shutdown. So they would certainly be able to go into more detail about the conversations that are ongoing with the private sector. What I would say is that and referring back to my statement, the Colombian government has levied a very significant amount in fines against violators, and quite enormous sums of money in many cases, in the context of Colombia or any place else. What they haven't done is collect those fines. And obviously that would send an extremely strong signal to the private sector. And that's something we're continuing to talk to them about and continuing to encourage them to move forward on. I would also add that my Department of Labor and USTR colleagues have a very strong working relationship with the Colombian Ministry of Labor, with the minister himself. It is a fluid, frank, candid relationship that they have. And so they are heavily engaged and will remain heavily engaged. And if I may say so, I think it's important that you all remain engaged. I think the visit that the chairman and Congressman Miller made is very important, and I think at every opportunity we need to keep engaging the Colombians on how they actually give effect to all of these important structural changes on the ground, as the chairman says.
And on a related note, do you expect that the USAID human rights programs will get continued support from the U.S. government? And what can we do working together to emphasize the importance of that?
I think they will certainly continue to have strong support within the administration, and I hope they will continue to have strong support in the U.S. Congress. We will certainly work towards that.
Thanks. I have one more question. We recently found out that the Constitutional Court nullified the expanded military jurisdiction over human rights abuse cases. Can you just give us a little bit of background on the U.S. government's original positions, and then also what's your reaction to this decision? What are the implications of this?
With respect to our position on this, we have made it quite clear to the Colombian government that we are in favor of civilian trials for human rights and other serious crimes, and that we are opposed to any step that might tend to lend itself to impunity. Now, I must say, President Santos has been very clear in saying that the military justice reform was not going to lend itself to impunity. Now that the Constitutional Court has acted, as they did last night, and struck down the reform, we, of course, need to actually sit down and study their decision. I understand that they did so, I understand this from the media, actually, that they did so on procedural grounds having to do with the way the law was moved through the Congress. But I think we're going to need to sit down and take a very careful look at that decision. And then, to be perfectly frank, I don't know what the Colombian government is going to do now, whether they're going to back up and take another attempt to get that law through Congress, and if they do that, when they would do that, and what the ultimate form of that law would be. I just don't know. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I have just one last question. Where does the United States government stand in the discussions on the continued presence of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Colombia? You know, OHCHR has been an important partner in the efforts to promote and defend human rights in Colombia. I mentioned in my opening statement about their role in helping to resolve this issue with the indigenous communities. Does the U.S. do we see their presence in Colombia as important in the next years, or do we have a position on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know that if we have taken a public position on the continuance of the CHR mandate there. I do know that the Colombian government has recently announced that they would extend the mandate for another year. We certainly engage very closely with the CHR office there. I met with some of their representatives earlier this week, and so that's a relationship we would look forward to continuing.
Right. Well, I appreciate that, and you know, we obviously have high regard for their work as well, and you know, get concerned every time, you know, we hear that you know, maybe their stay might be extended, or maybe it might not be extended. Again, I think that especially during in these next crucial few years, I think any support we can give them would be much appreciated. But I thank you very much for your testimony. Appreciate you being here, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
We'll now call our next panel, Adam Isaacson, Senior Associate for Regional Security Policy at the Washington Office on Latin America, and Dr. Virginia M. Bouvier, Senior Program Officer for Latin America, United States Institute of Peace. Mr. Isaacson, why don't you begin?
Thank you, Congressman McGovern, and thank you, Congresswoman Bonamici, for coming to this hearing. Thank you to the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for holding it. It's really great that we're taking a moment to give a little scrutiny to a country that is very important to the United States, very important to the Western Hemisphere, and it doesn't get the attention that it probably should be getting. And this is an exciting and also a frightening time for Colombia. It's exciting because this is Latin America's #3 country in population, and suddenly it is facing a real chance to end its conflict. It's a conflict that has killed 220,000 people over the last 55 years. In 200 years as an independent country, Colombia has had really only a few moments of actual peace where there were no violent groups with national reach active in its territory. Colombians may be closing in on one of those moments. Getting there depends on whether the negotiations with the FARC guerrilla group can succeed. And then Colombians face the challenge of making this permanent, avoiding repetition of what they've lived through in the last 55 years. But this is also a frightening time for Colombia. The peace process isn't guaranteed success, not by any means. The talks are now a year old. They're on their 16th round, and they're only on the second of 5 agenda items. And it's almost November when the campaign officially begins for congressional elections in March and presidential elections in May. The negotiators are going to have 3 choices once November hits. Do they keep negotiating amid the distraction and the uncertainty of a political campaign? Did they put the dialogues on hold for 6 months and hope that they'll be easy to restart after the elections? Or did they just get up from the table and cancel the entire process? I personally think that they are going to manage to keep the talks alight through the election season, even if they move slowly. If they do, and if Colombians elect a presidential candidate who wants to continue the talks, a reasonable time frame to expect a peace accord, I think, would be before the end of 2014. And then the real hard part starts. Colombia is going to have to demobilize 20,000 or more guerrillas, urban militias, members of support networks. It will have to give them enough education and psychological support to rejoin society and not to be tempted to return to the jungles or to violent crime. That won't be easy. Colombia has had a tough time demobilizing and reintegrating about 55,000 people over the past 10 years. Unemployment is constant and the lure of organized crime is strong. And then, of those who do demobilize, a few of them won't be able to get amnesty or suspended sentences because the human rights abuses they ordered or committed are just too extreme. So some top leaders are going to be expected to turn in their weapons and then go to something like prison. That's really hard to make them do. Colombia must somehow find an arrangement that's tough enough on FARC leaders who committed the worst abuses, but still tolerable enough that these leaders will still go along with it. This kind of transitional justice is for the victimizers, but post-conflict Colombia would also need to do something for the victims. 5.8 million Colombians, 12% of the population, have already signed up with the government's National Registry of Victims. They must get restitution of what was taken from them. They must get the truth about what happened to them and their loved ones, and overall, they must have a process that upholds their dignity. And even then, a post-conflict Colombia could be even more violent than it is today. Think of northern Mexico today, or Venezuela, or the northern countries of Central America. There are no guerrillas in those places, but organized crime has corrupted institutions and driven violence to higher rates than Colombia's today. If peace talks succeed, Colombians will need public security as much as ever, but they won't need heavily armed soldiers going on offensives, or herbicide-spraying planes eradicating plants. They're going to need police, more than they have now, police that are tied to their communities and accountable to a strong civilian justice system. Making all of this happen will require extraordinary political will from the Colombian government. It will need to marshal massive resources with minimal bureaucracy, inefficiency, and corruption, and to do so in the face of opposition from corrupt local political bosses, organized criminals, unethical landowners, factions of the security forces, and others. These, let's call them recalcitrant actors, they're going to play dirty, maybe even use violence to stop the government from restituting land, enforcing labor standards, or complying with commitments made at the peace table. The increase in killings of human rights defenders in Colombia so far this year shows that they already are. Still, the government of President Juan Manuel Santos has launched several well-intentioned efforts. There's been a territorial consolidation program, the Labor Action Plan, the Land Restitution and Victims Law. The trouble is, these efforts have all moved quite slowly. The government's programs have been hobbled by a lack of managerial capacity, a lack of political backing, and direct opposition from those who play dirty at the local level. Good intentions are a start, but execution and implementation are hard. And without them, a future peace accord will be little more than a piece of paper. The United States can help with this. It's in our interest to see Colombia at peace, and we must stand ready to help Colombia bridge the gap from intentions to implementation. Political backing is a big part of this, and it's important as economic aid and a lot cheaper. Any Colombian leader who is honest, well-intentioned, and democratic should know she has a steadfast friend in the United States. Both in and out of government, Colombians are working to put the violence behind them, to embark on a rare new moment of peace, and to make that moment permanent. We need to stick up for them. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bouvier?
Thank you very much, Congressman McGovern. I'd like to thank the chairs of the Tom Lantos Committee on Human Rights, Congressman Jim McGovern and Congressman Frank Wolf, as well as Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, and members of this committee for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to speak with you today. This is an important hearing at a critical time for peace in Colombia. I'm Dr. Virginia Bouvier. I'm the Senior Program Officer for Latin America at the U.S. Institute of Peace. The U.S. Congress created the Institute in 1984 with a mandate to contribute to the prevention, resolution, and management of international conflicts. USIP personnel are on the ground in some of the world's most volatile regions of the world, working to support peace and the resolution of conflicts. The views The views I expressed today are my own and not those of USIP, which does not take positions on specific policies. As Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos recently noted, making war is much easier than seeking peace. We should applaud President Santos for his courage in taking the more difficult and ultimately more stable route. The prospects for peace in Colombia are promising, though not without risks. The government and the FARC have developed a methodology, an agenda, and a roadmap, have reached agreement on land reforms, and are moving steadily toward a final agreement. And here perhaps my testimony varies a bit from the interpretation of Adam Isaacson. I think that this agreement that's been reached on land is really historic, and if implemented, if it goes to the final agreement, that it will really make a difference. The process, however, is vulnerable, particularly as the election season gets underway. Adam's outlined some of the prospects ahead of us. Peace talks with the National Liberation Army, the ELN, have yet to be launched, and peace will be more stable if it includes both the FARC and the ELN. U.S. government efforts to help Colombia win the peace should now match its efforts. U.S. efforts in the past to win the war should now be matched by efforts to win the peace. To this end, the USG and all of its agencies should consistently support the peace process in Havana and encourage a peace process with the ELN. The USG should actively persuade potential spoilers of the benefits of peace and ensure that its messaging is clear. And here I pick up on some of the discussion about the U.S. working with friends in the military to make sure that they understand that peace is in their interests and the interests of the country. The USG should also consider reasonable requests from the parties that would facilitate peace. These may relate to U.S. counter-narcotics policies, extradition practices, release of U.S. records relating to the conflict, or other measures. A peace agreement is a necessary but insufficient condition for peace. It's necessary because it will end our guerrilla insurgency of nearly 50 years. It's insufficient because the conflict with the insurgents represents only a fraction of the violence in Colombia. And I know you understand this, Congressman McGovern, from your various trips to Colombia. Given that half of all comprehensive peace accords fail within the first 5 years after they're signed, the international community should scale up resources in this very vulnerable post-conflict period to ensure that peace holds. Just over 1% of the Colombian population owns half the land, and the illegal usurpation of some 6.6 million hectares has displaced about 5 million Colombians. Efforts to restitute lands have already generated a backlash, and the Attorney General in Colombia has warned of a dirty war in the post-accord period. U.S. policy should support victims to exercise effectively and safely their rights to truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-repetition. It should vigorously advocate for the legitimate right to nonviolent dissent and the right to organize to defend human rights, including labor rights in Colombia. This committee should continue to monitor the status of human rights in Colombia. Protection is the cornerstone of sustainable peace there. The USG should partner with traditionally marginalized groups in their efforts to redress discrimination, exclusion, and inequity. Women, Afro-Colombians, indigenous peoples, youth, and peasants are indispensable partners in the consolidation of peace. Peace will not automatically trickle down with the signing of a peace accord. It will take years to implement peace accords, heal the legacies of conflict, and transform the attitudes and structures that have allowed this to happen. The U.S. should support capacity building for implementing peace accords at the municipal and regional levels. The U.S. Institute of Peace has seen the impact of small investments in historical memory initiatives, capacity building in human rights and conflict resolution, including mediation, facilitation, and dialogue, regional peace and development initiatives, and local reconciliation models. These are critical to long-term reconciliation and cost-effective in preventing future violence. Violence against women has been strategically employed as a weapon of war by all sides of the conflict and is part of a continuum of violence fostered by discrimination and exclusion. Empowering women's contributions to peace will diminish the risks of future violence. U.S. leadership should be employed in Colombia to ensure that women and men participate in decisions affecting their communities and benefit equally from the peace dividend. Violence against women is addressed in any ceasefire or peace agreements. And demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration programs meet the differential needs of boys, girls, men, and women, and include measures to prevent violence against women in communities where ex-combatants demobilize. The U.S. Institute of Peace has a track record helping to foster and secure peace and to prevent violent conflict. We look forward to working with the committee to advance our shared goals. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And let me begin by asking you both the same question. I mean, what makes this peace process different than previous initiatives? What are the things that make us feel more hopeful? What are the things that should make us more concerned? I think I think there's some here in the United States who are just aren't quite sure that this is going to actually result in a peace accord. But I'd be interested in kind of hearing your interpretation of why this is a different moment.
Great. Can I?
Yeah, good.
Oh, go ahead. That's a great question. Thank you very much. I think for me, this process is very different because you have a prior agreement that was reached in August, what they call the framework agreement. This represented 6 months of the two parties sitting down and coming up with an agenda. It's a modest agenda. It has 6 points. It's a reasonable agenda. In the past, this has not been possible. In addition to having the agenda, they've come up with a roadmap for working forward, a work plan. They seem to have constructed a very high level of confidence at the table so that between the parties you actually have discussions going on, you have some sort of compromises taking place on the issue of the land. They came up with a land agreement. This may not seem like much. I think people look at it and they say, boy, they've been talking for a year and they still only have one agreement on land. Well, if land's been the root of the conflict and they were able to come up with an agreement on land, I think that's extremely significant. I think secondly, they've really looked, both sides have really looked at the past peace processes and tried to garner lessons from the past to work into this process. One of the things they've done, they have military, business, and police sectors represented on the negotiating team. These are sectors that have historically really created opposition to any peace process. So having them on board, I think, was a very smart move on Santos's part. There have been a number of agreements made on both sides. One, early on, the FARC agreed to stop its practice of kidnapping. The Colombian government moved forward some legislation to address victims and land issues in the Congress. As each of these happens, it's a kind of link that you see in many peace processes where one side will do one thing if the other side does another. And I think this process of give and take seems to have been successful so far. I think one of the problems that you've seen has been that there's a disconnect between the public views and the press and the media attention to what's happening at the table and what's actually happening there. If you listen, if you zero in on what the negotiators themselves are saying about the peace talks, they're saying there is progress. They're not necessarily happy with how fast it's going, but they're saying they're taking their time, they're looking at the issues, they're moving through, they're trying to find points of reconciliation between the sides. I think this is the important signal, more than what the press says as to whether it's happening fast enough or not. Clearly, there's an election in Colombia. President Santos needs certain things from the table to show that he's getting progress at the table. So the pressure is really on to produce something. But I think as long as both sides are saying that they're moving forward, that we should give them the chance to continue to move forward, even if it takes longer than we might like. I would just add also, I think the international context is very different now. I think you've had progressive leadership come in different parts of Latin America and former guerrillas, including former guerrillas in different parts of Latin America, and even within Colombia itself, you have former guerrillas who have become mayors and governors and exerted leadership from an elected, nonviolent platform. So it really has undermined any justification that any party might have to continue armed struggle, and I think that's created a different environment in which peace talks can be a politically viable path forward for the guerrillas.
I would just add a couple of elements that make this different. One, sort of the balance of forces in the conflict. Right now, they're not evenly matched. The Colombian government has a strong advantage. The FARC are weaker. But you're in a moment where the FARC probably realize that they can't win at this point, that they have no hope of taking power through violence. The Colombian government, on the other hand, is probably realizing now that they can't just simply win on the battlefield either, that they're not in the home stretch. The FARC still have 7,000 fighters. They're attacking at the same rate as they were before, and that it would take many bloody years to finish this. So there's sort of a herding stalemate going on that really does help move things along. Another thing that helps is that they're negotiating outside Colombia, where they are away from a lot of the pressures that Virginia is talking about. The agenda is another advantage or difference. It is not as ambitious as in the past. They're not trying to remake the economic system. They're not the security and defense and what the role of the military is not on the table. It is important but more modest. And I'm most encouraged by the fact, as Ginny said, that they are respecting the ground rules in a very serious way of the talks, that there's a lot of discipline, a lot of respect for the secrecy and discretion of the talks, and for all the bluster and bravado that you might hear in FARC declarations, they have really stuck to the framework. But the challenges, I agree, are public opinion, impatience with the process. The polls show the majority of Colombians supporting the talks, but also a majority of Colombians doubting that they will succeed. And that perception does get fed every time an opponent of the talks gets a microphone, or every time things drag on with another few rounds with nothing new happening. But still, as I said in my testimony, I do think that they are going to muddle through and within a year or so probably finish this.
Just a couple more questions. How can the United States government better support the peace process? What are we not doing that we should be doing now? And what should we be prepared to do in the future if this peace accord actually gets negotiated and agreed upon?
I've tried to mention some very specific things within my testimony, but I think that making sure that the message is clear and consistent across the different agencies of the U.S. government. I think, and that includes the military. So I think so far the position has been that the U.S. is supporting the peace process, and I think that's good. I think it should be reiterated over and over and over, and everyone should have the same message. I think also, as I mentioned, looking beyond the peace accord, Colombia, I think, like many countries, has good legislation. It has good written documents, but the actual implementation and holding to account of what those documents say sometimes lags behind. So I think the U.S. looking ahead toward implementation, helping build capacity for that implementation at the municipal and local, or municipal and regional levels as well as national level. The USAID, I think, has done a good job of trying to support the victims in land restitution law. It's had a rough time getting off the ground. It's faced a lot of administrative challenges, some of which has to do with a lack of preparation and training of the officials who are supposed to be implementing the legislation. It also has to do with a lack of capacity for the victims to know where to go to have their claims heard. I mean, midway through a process, all of a sudden there was a new process that came into effect, and I think the lead time in trying to get people out to the regions to let the folks on the ground know what they should be doing and how their past claims might no longer be valid and they might have to start a new process, and providing some sort of not only legal accompaniment but psychological accompaniment, advocates who can be out there who can help people get through this very, very difficult process of restituting lands or being repaired for victimization.
Do you think the message that the United States government supports these peace talks is clear enough or loud enough for the Colombian military at this particular point? I mean,
for the military, I'm not sure. I would also say, there's kind of a mentality shift that needs to happen when you go from war to peace. There has been a mentality, I think a lot of the human rights violations that we're hearing about and that your committee has been looking at for so long have to do with a kind of counterinsurgency model where anyone who is trying to promote change is seen as the enemy. And I think that kind of mentality needs to change dramatically. There has to be a greater sense that a more just society and more just structures will ultimately be more stable, and that is in the national security interest of Colombia. And if you don't get that message through loud and clear, and if people don't really buy into it, you're going to have that dirty war that the Attorney General is warning about.
And Mr. Isaac, if you respond to that. I mean, and I'm also kind of, assuming everything goes the way we want it to go, I mean, the U.S. will have to play a role. We might have to reorient some of our drug policies. We might have to, support, certain implementation processes. But I'd be curious to get your.
Yeah, I mean, there's three elements that I think of U.S. policy that I think are important here. First is simply words. I try to keep track of every utterance by a U.S. official about these peace talks, and we're really down to an average of about once every 2 months that some official, it's been high-profile people like Vice President Biden, actually gets out in front of a microphone and says, this is something the United States supports and wants to succeed. I think we should be a little more frequent because there are very prominent politicians and others in Colombia who are criticizing the process every day, and a lot of those politicians are associated with the having had past U.S. support. So we have to counterbalance that. And of course, our private words, I can't judge because I don't know what's being said privately, but we are certainly helping Colombia's military still very much with its battlefield campaign plan against the FARC. I hope that in a process of doing that, we are communicating to the Colombian military that they have to get behind this process. I'm not convinced that that's happening. The second is drug policy. That's the fourth agenda on the peace talks. Most likely, the Colombian government and FARC will agree to something that makes the United States uncomfortable because it will run against what we've been doing for many years. One thing that could happen, for instance, is they might agree to severely curtail the aerial herbicide fumigation program. I think we have to be flexible and go along with that and give it the benefit of the doubt and make sure that our drug policy goals are met a different way in the post-conflict. And finally, simply money. The United States has given Colombia $9 billion since 2000. That's about $600 million a year. Over those years, it's been almost exactly 3/4 for the security forces. That won't make sense in the post-conflict. We're going to have to support a lot of non-military priorities, like the things that Virginia was mentioning, land, demobilization, and justice, and others.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your testimony. I wanted to follow up on, Dr. Bouvier, what you said about a change in mentality and a country that's going from really a constant state of conflict since it looks like the 40s, and with the two main groups, the FARC and ELN, being around since the 60s, we've had at least a couple of generations of people who have grown up and lived in the country under the way it is now in the state of violence. So can you talk a little bit about the Colombian youth? And you mentioned, Mr. Isaacson, that most Colombians are glad that there are peace talks, but they're skeptical about whether they will actually be effective. So if either of you, I have not had the pleasure of visiting or the honor of visiting Colombia, but if you could talk a little bit about that shift in mentality and what is being done, whether it be through the education system or youth groups or women's rights groups, to sort of change that, given that so many people have grown up in a country with so much conflict and entire generations now. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman Bonamici. I think there are a number of things, and I think youth is actually the place that you need to focus efforts. USIP is giving a grant right now to a foundation in Medellin, the Mi Sangre Foundation, that is supporting transformation of attitudes through cultural activities. It's bringing young people and their families and educators, it's working through the school systems as well, to have some faith in their own creativity and their ability to not only accept themselves but accept other people. I remember when I was visiting Medellin that someone from the mayor's office there told me that the indicator that they found most significant for violence in the very poor barrios, areas, neighborhoods, was whether or not there were after-school programs for children. That if children had something to do after school, music, drama, theater, sports, that this actually gave them a legitimate way to turn down efforts to recruit them into armed groups. Now, without that, it became a kind of confrontation between young people of somebody saying, you know, come with us, we're going to go hang out. But it became a very legitimate reason for them to turn it down. So I think the cultural programming is one way that that different communities are finding to reach youth and to give them options, to think about. I think there's a real desperation that comes with living your whole life in a time of war. And trying to envision something different requires creativity. And the arts, I think, are one way that you can begin to think outside of the box and think more creatively and envision what a different kind of future might be like. We're also supporting, and I should say the U.S. Congress is supporting, because you, of course, give us our budget. We're supporting a group, Hijos e Hijas de la Memoria contra la Impunidad y por la Memoria. This is a group of young people most of whose parents have either disappeared or been killed oftentimes for their political activities, oftentimes progressive activities on the left. This group is a really phenomenal group of leaders, ethical leaders, who are trying to look at their own histories of victimhood in a new light and see how they can build capacity within themselves to be peace leaders in Colombia. They designed their own schooling. They decided who in Colombian society they admired most, who they could learn from most. They worked with educators to make sure that they were grounded in the history of Colombia, in the history of Colombia's conflict, as well as the history of the efforts to achieve peace in Colombia. And I think projects like this, where you're able to build capacity and let them build their own capacity, because it's not like we're going in and telling them this is how you have to do it, but you give them a space to learn from each other and to create new visions of how a Colombia at peace might be and how they can contribute to that. And I think young people want to contribute. They want to have a voice. They want to have a say. They don't want to just take the war that's been handed down generation after generation. They want to change.
Thank you. Mr. Isaacson, did you have anything to?
Sure, just very quickly. About 30% of the FARC are below the age of 18, and that's similar with other armed groups by most estimates. And you know, you've got both in parts of rural Colombia where poverty rates are usually around 70%, and urban slums, youth face these choices where you can be a subsistence farmer, or you can try to make do in the informal economy, or you can join one of these groups and get a lot of money and respect for doing unspeakable things. And we have to combat that. But in much of Latin America, this is an issue. The term is ni estudia ni trabaja. Doesn't study, doesn't work. And that, unfortunately, applies to a large percentage of the young, you know, sort of the 15 to 30 population in a lot of in Colombia, but in Honduras, San Pedro Sula, Honduras, in Monterrey, Mexico, in Kingston, Jamaica, it's the same thing. And it has to be a very big emphasis of our assistance.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And Dr. Bouvier mentioned Mi Sangre. I had the pleasure of visiting them in Medellin a few years back, and in addition to providing kind of after-school opportunities, it's really kind of unique. It uses the arts as a way to try to help young people build self-esteem and help try to solve problems without resorting to violence. And it's really really quite an incredible initiative. And again, I get to see it firsthand, which it is. If you go to Medellin, I'll give you all the information you need to know to go to see it. I just have one final question for you, because this is, you know, I mean, I worry about the issue of impunity. You know, where people who have committed terrible human rights atrocities on both sides, where there's no accountability, and you know, and there have been efforts to reintegrate former paramilitary individuals into society, which I think it's probably fair to say is a questionable success. You know, how do we do this differently? Because it is a really difficult subject. I mean, there are people in the FARC who have been guilty of some horrific human rights violations. There are people not only associated with the paramilitaries, but people who are associated with the military, who have been guilty of serious and terrible human rights violations. How do we approach this differently, and how do we approach it in a way where we don't disregard human rights. I mean, I remember when the peace accord in El Salvador was signed, and there was a general amnesty granted to everybody, and I was told by a number of people, well, you know, something has to give. But I would argue that that was a mistake in El Salvador, and I don't think that we ought to just toss human rights aside. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts about how we should approach this differently.
I think there are two standards that are the benchmarks. Victims' rights, that's victims' rights to truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-repetition on the one side. The state's obligation to investigate, prosecute, and punish those violators. Colombia is a pioneer in that there's now an international criminal court as a peace process is going forward. So the negotiators at the peace tables are very aware that if they don't find a balance that respects these rights, and these are victims' rights and government obligations that are not just international law, but they are Colombians' own law, because they have incorporated their obligations in the international realm into their own legislation. So these are Colombian commitments to respect the rights of victims and to fulfill their obligations to investigate, prosecute, and punish. Now, I think where there's room for interpretation is how do you do that? What is justice? What will constitute justice for the victims? And what will constitute justice for the perpetrators who will have their day in court and are entitled to their day in court? So I think finding a process that's an independent process where there is consultation and there is a possibility of getting at the truth, whatever that truth might be, is a really important first step. And I think apologies are a big part of it. We've already started to see acknowledgments of wrongdoing, both by the FARC and the government. This is a really good sign. It's not gotten down to real specifics and real particulars, and I think it needs to get there. But I think a year ago, we would not have seen apologies from either side, and I think this is also a sign that what's happening at the table is really something different and something very hopeful.
As Ginny said, this is the first peace process ever to happen with a country that's a signatory to the International Criminal Court, so there are some things that Colombia simply cannot forgive or even give suspended sentences for, and the prosecutor of the ICC has already written letters to that effect. The upshot of that for the FARC means that some number of FARC members, probably in the low hundreds, who are responsible for what qualifies as crimes against humanity, simply can't be amnestied and probably can't simply or even go through a trial and have the sentence suspended afterwards. Something is going to happen that deprives them of liberty for some fixed period of time, probably not forever, but some reduced period of time. What that's going to look like is one of the $64,000 questions of Colombia's peace process. Because how do you get somebody who has 7,000 people in arms and hundreds of millions of dollars in a war budget every year to give up their weapon and walk into some sort of confinement where they're guarded by Colombian authorities? That will be humiliating for them. The optimistic side of me, however, says that if I'm a FARC leader who is truly giving up criminality and truly giving up getting money through the drug trade and everything else, I suddenly have no way to support myself. Not like I'm going to suddenly get a job and have somebody hire me. At the same time, there are thousands of Colombians who would probably take a shot at me, and I cannot be easily protected because I'm so unpopular. Maybe it would be good to have a place where for several years I am guarded by police. Inside those grounds, as happened with some former ELN leaders and others, I can meet with visitors, I can plan my political movement, I can talk to the media, but I can't leave. That could be, if not attractive, at least tolerable for guerrilla leaders. But that is something that they're going to have to discuss in the third and fifth parts of the agenda, which are transitional justice and how to help victims. And we'll see what comes out of that.
Did you have another question?
Thank you. I just had one more quick question. Mr. Isaacson, you said in your written testimony that the FARC is holding a U.S. citizen who in June of 2013 traveled into the southern jungles. And you said also that the guerrillas say they're willing to release him, but the Colombian president has refused to release the release on conditions that would cause a media show. Is there any update on that situation? Thank you.
Unfortunately, there's not. The last thing to happen was about a month ago. Jesse Jackson went to Havana and talked with FARC leaders about this and offered himself as somebody to whom the FARC in the jungles could release this gentleman, along with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the Colombian government refused that. And so far, since then, there's been no new communications about it.
Perhaps some of the members of this committee might be interested in proposing that they might assist in that.
I think we tried that before, but anyway, yeah.
No, they-
But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very
both.
much.
But now I'd like to call up our final panel. Now, let me get my Celeste Drake, Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist, the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. Max Schoening, Colombia researcher with Human Rights Watch. Liliana Avila, Human Rights Attorney with the Interchurch Justice and Peace Commission. Jomardi Ortegan, Human Rights Attorney with the Jose Alvia Restrepo Collective of Lawyers. So why don't we go in the order I called you up? So we'll begin with Ms. Celeste Drake. There you go.
Thank you. Chairman McGovern, Congresswoman Bonamici, good morning. On behalf of the AFL-CIO, I thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for its consideration of human rights in Colombia, and Chairman McGovern in particular for the generous time and effort that he and his incredible staff dedicate to protecting Colombia's most vulnerable. Despite some progress in recent years, including efforts by Vice President Angelino Garzón and Labor Minister Rafael Pardo to help workers benefit from the Labor Action Plan, Colombian workers report minimal progress. Two of the three main goals of the Labor Action Plan were the prevention of violence against labor leaders and the prosecution of perpetrators of such violence. The plan has not been fully successful on either count. Though there has been some reduction in violence in recent years, Colombia remains a place in which exercising workplace rights puts you and your family at risk. In 2012, ENS reported 22 murders of trade unionists and 641 total acts of violence and intimidation. These incidents are part of a decades-long campaign of terror to prevent workers from acting collectively to better their lives. In July, two leaders of the Sinal Trenal Union in Barranca Bermeja, William Mendoza Gomez and Juan Carlos Galvis and their families received death threats. And in August, the paramilitary group Rastrojo Urban Commandos levied death threats against 30 individuals and their families, most of them trade unionists. These threats are effective. Given the history of violence against disenfranchised groups in Colombia, workers and their advocates have no reason to discount them. Unions report that workers involved in strikes, organizing efforts, and other collective actions often immediately renounce union membership or leave the locale altogether in order to keep their families safe. The AFL-CIO has been unable to find evidence that significant progress has been made in identifying and convicting intellectual authors of crimes against trade unionists, whether the incidents are recent or years old. The other main goal of the Labor Action Plan was to protect internationally recognized worker rights. Unfortunately, workers still face termination, blacklisting, and other forms of discrimination as a consequence of exercising fundamental labor rights. For years, employers in Colombia have used various forms of labor intermediation in order to avoid affording workers their rights under the law, not only freedom of association and collective bargaining, but also social protections due to employees, such as pension and insurance contributions. Despite a reduction in the number of registered cooperatives, the Labor Action Plan has had little effect on the overall rate of labor intermediation. This is because too many employers have switched their employees from cooperatives to other forms of subcontracting, including simplified stock companies, known as SAS, and contratos sindicales, or union contracts, which might sound good, but rarely function as representative worker-controlled unions. Realizing that the initial Labor Action Plan instruments, including Decree 2025 and Article 200, were having too small an impact on formalizing Colombia's workforce, the government recently enacted Law 1610, designed to provide a clear path by which employers could directly hire their employees and avoid fines and sanctions. But Law 1610 to date has proved less than effective. For example, on one palm oil plantation, an agreement signed in November 2011 was thought to cover 600 workers. But in July 2013, the Ministry of Labor announced a formalization accord covering only 45 workers through a SOS, and only 12 of those received permanent contracts. Putting workers into a SOS is simply not an acceptable form of formalization. And there's been no action at all to formalize the remaining 555 workers. In another priority sector, ports, workers in Buenaventura continue to work in cooperatives despite the fact that their employer was found in violation of the law over a year ago. The workers have been trying to negotiate a formalization plan, but their employer failed to attend the last meeting. Unfortunately, the Ministry of Labor has done little to prevent or punish such stalling tactics, and it appears that many employers believe they can continue to violate worker rights with impunity. Progress on other action plan priorities, including collective pacts, criminal prosecutions for employer interference with labor rights, and clear definitions of essential services, has been deplorably lacking. More than 2 years after the Labor Action Plan went into effect, workers expected more. Sporadic inspections and token fines that go unpaid don't add up to the systemic changes required. Increased attention and resources by both the U.S. government and the Colombian government are necessary. The Ministry of Labor's efforts must evolve into a comprehensive and reliable enforcement plan. The AFL-CIO urges the U.S. government to increase its efforts to ensure the Labor Action Plan's fulfillment, including, if necessary, by making clear that continued failure to address violations of internationally recognized worker rights constitutes a violation of Colombia's commitments under the trade agreement that could result in suspension of trade benefits. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Schoening?
Chairman McGovern, Congresswoman Bonamici, thank you for the opportunity to address the Commission on the critically important issue of human rights in Colombia. My name is Max Schoening, and I'm the Colombia researcher for Human Rights Watch. My testimony today will focus on threats and attacks against internally displaced Colombians seeking land restitution. Violence associated with Colombia's internal armed conflict has driven more than 5 million people from their homes, generating the world's largest population of internally displaced persons, IDPs. Colombian IDPs are estimated to have left behind 6 million hectares of land, much of which armed groups, their allies, and others seized in land grabs. In June 2011, President Juan Manuel Santos took an unprecedented step towards addressing this immense human rights problem by securing passage of the Victims' Law, which aims to return land to hundreds of thousands of displaced families during a decade of implementation. The land restitution program is the most important human rights initiative of the Santos administration. As ambitious as the law is, however, Colombia has made little progress in implementing it, as Human Rights Watch revealed in a report released last month. The government has received more than 45,000 land restitution claims, but as of September 2013, only 1% had resulted in court rulings ordering restitution. By that date, more than 2 years since the Victims' Law was enacted, the government could only confirm 3 cases of families who had returned to live on their land as a result of court rulings under the law. Of the myriad obstacles to implementing land restitution, security is perhaps the greatest. IDPs who have sought to recover land through the Victims' Law and other restitution mechanisms have been subject to widespread abuses tied to their efforts, including killings, new incidents of forced displacement, and death threats. In researching our report, Human Rights Watch documented 17 cases of killings of IDP land claimants and leaders since 2008, in circumstances that provide compelling evidence the attacks were motivated by the victims' activism. Official data suggests the total number of such killings may be even higher. The Attorney General's office reported that it was investigating 43 cases of killings of land restitution leaders and claimants committed since 2008. And since 2012, more than 700 IDPs and their leaders attempting to reclaim land through the Victims' Law have reported receiving threats. The threats and attacks are entirely predictable given Colombia's chronic failure to deliver justice for both current and past abuses against IDP claimants. Prosecutors have not charged a single suspect in any of their investigations into threats against land claimants and leaders. Moreover, justice authorities have rarely prosecuted the people who originally displaced claimants and stole their land. Of the more than 17,000 open investigations into cases of forced displacement handled by the main prosecutorial unit dedicated to pursuing such crimes, only 28 had led to a conviction as of January 2013. Authorities' failure to significantly curb the power of paramilitary successor groups also poses a direct threat to land claimant security. Successor groups to the officially demobilized AUC paramilitary coalition have carried out a large share of the threats and attacks targeting displaced land claimants. In addition, third parties who took over lands after original occupants were first forced out, as well as left-wing FARC guerrillas, have also targeted land claimants. The government's protection program, which is unparalleled in the region, has provided hundreds of at-risk land claimants with protection measures, such as bulletproof vests and bodyguards. While helpful, these are essentially palliative measures, since they do not rein in or hold accountable the armed groups, criminal mafias, and others who are threatening claimants' lives. In Human Rights Watch's view, a more strategic approach by prosecutors, in coordination with restitution efforts, could go a long way toward ensuring justice and thus protection for IDPs seeking to return to their land. In particular, Colombian prosecutors should work with land restitution authorities to vigorously pursue crimes against land claimants in areas where restitution is being carried out. The United States should urge Colombia to adopt such a strategy and provide the necessary assistance to do it. Unless Colombia ensures justice for current and past abuses against IDP land claimants, many more will suffer threats, episodes of displacement, and killings, and the Santos administration's signature human rights initiative could be fundamentally undermined. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Avila.
Buenos días, un saludo al senador Magor y a la senadora Bonamici, agradeciendo pues la oportunidad de dar mi testimonio en esta audiencia. Mi nombre es Liliana Ávila y hago parte de la Comisión Intereclesial de Justicia y Paz, que es una organización de defensa de derechos humanos en Colombia que acompaña a comunidades afrodescendientes, mestizas e indígenas.
So, good morning to Representatives McGovern and Representative Suzanne Bonamici. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to testify today. My name is Liliana Avila, and I'm a lawyer with the Interecclesial Commission for Justice and Peace, and we work and support communities who are Afro-descendant, mestizo, and indigenous.
A partir del acompañamiento realizado desde la Comisión, hemos podido constatar que la situación de vulneración de derechos humanos a las comunidades indígenas y afrodescendientes continúa siendo crítica.
So, as part of our accompaniment, we can say fully that the situation of vulnerability of the communities that are Afro-descendant and indigenous continues to be grave.
La fuente de estas vulneraciones y amenazas a los derechos está ligada al conflicto por la tierra, la definición del uso de los suelos y un modelo de desarrollo que pretende imponerse en sus territorios, ignorando sus costumbres históricas y prácticas ancestrales.
So part of the reason why you have this vulnerability of human rights is linked to the internal conflict, linked to conflict over land, linked to different ideas of what should be done with the subsoil. And we find that all of this together leads to a situation that is making them vulnerable.
En ambas regiones del país, habitadas ancestralmente por comunidades afrodescendientes, sectores empresariales, algunos de ellos vinculados con el paramilitarismo, han ejercido proyectos productivos especialmente de palma, de siembra de monocultivo, ganadería extensiva y extracción de recursos naturales.
And so what we see is that some part of the countries where you have communities that have inhabited these areas ancestrally, that the sectors, the private sectors have been linked to paramilitaries, and they've executed and pretended to execute different productive projects such as the cultivation of monocultural crops and also agriculture projects and the extraction of resources and infrastructure projects.
Tenemos evidencia de que estos paramilitares continúan actuando en connivencia con autoridades civiles y militares colombianas.
And we have direct evidence that these companies continue to operate in coexistence with paramilitaries, and that those paramilitaries also are in coexistence with some of the authorities of the Colombian government.
En este contexto, la ley de víctimas y restitución de tierras, aunque es un paso importante, gracias al control local y a la impunidad de las dificultades de implementación, puede convertirse en un factor que legalice el despojo.
So while the law of land restitution is important, we think that unless these obstacles are addressed, that there will be impunity in these situations. And some of the abandonment of the lands would actually be facilitated.
Esta situación se ilustra bien con las comunidades del Bajo Atrato chocoano. Muchas de ellas han sido visitadas por varios miembros del Congreso de la República, del Congreso de los Estados Unidos, que han hecho seguimiento a la situación.
So one emblematic case is the case of the communities in the Lower Atrato region of the Chocó. This is areas and communities that have been visited by different members of the U.S. government.
Luego del desplazamiento, empresas cultivadoras de palma, banano y plátano y ganadería extensiva vinculadas con el paramilitarismo se asentaron en su región e iniciaron megaproyectos.
And so what we saw was that there was a mass displacement of the population in these areas, and shortly after, companies such as oil palm companies, banana companies, and agricultural sectors linked to paramilitaries overtook these lands.
Desde entonces sus tierras no han sido restituidas y en la actualidad están siendo ocupadas por empresarios y terceros patrocinados por estos.
And so currently these lands have not been restituted to the victims. However, we see that these companies and so forth have continued to occupy these areas, or that third parties have been integrated in these areas.
Pese a que organismos nacionales e internacionales han reconocido la relación directa de violaciones a derechos humanos, la implementación de megaproyectos y han urgido al Estado para que tome acciones para revertir el despojo.
And what we've seen is that national and international authorities have urged the Colombian state to basically look into these violations generated by the mega projects, and we have not seen action.
El caso de Curvarado y Guamiandó es un caso emblemático y es quizás el más documentado. Es además un reto institucional cuyo éxito dará un mensaje al resto de víctimas y al proceso de paz.
So the case of Curvarado y Guamiandó is a very emblematic case. It's a very well-documented case, and if this were to be resolved positively, it would give a very important message to the rest of the cases in Colombia.
Sin embargo, en el 2010, la Corte Constitucional ordenó al Gobierno Nacional adelantar un proceso de restitución transparente, participativo y democrático.
And in 2010, the Constitutional Court ordered that there be a land restitution process that is transparent and democratic,
para viabilizar el retorno de las comunidades con plenas garantías y que ellas pudieran hacer uso y goce de sus tierras.
so that the victims can return to their lands with full guarantees and they can use their lands in the way they see fit.
Desde entonces, la Corte Constitucional se ha pronunciado 5 veces ordenando al Gobierno Nacional tomar medidas necesarias para tal fin.
And the Constitutional Court, since 2010, has ordered the Colombian government on 5 occasions to take steps to move forward in this direction.
Sin embargo, actualmente existe un grave riesgo de que el proceso de restitución termine por favorecer los sectores empresariales vinculados con el paramilitarismo.
However, what we see right now is that there's a very high risk that this process of restitution at this time may lead to favoring the interests of the companies that are linked to paramilitaries.
Varias de las víctimas del despojo han sido excluidas de este proceso.
various victims that were originally displaced have been excluded from the process.
Y pese a las denuncias de las irregularidades del proceso, el gobierno continúa con esto.
However, the Colombian government continues with this process despite the fact that there have been various denouncements of these irregularities taking place.
De continuar así, la entrega de tierra sería solo una formalidad que no devolvería la tierra a sus víctimas y legalizaría el despojo.
And so if things continue the way that they are moving forward right now, what we will see is a process that will just basically give legitimacy to illegality and that the true victims will not get their lands restituted.
Si esto pasa, esto sería un mensaje devastador para el resto de las víctimas que esperan restituir sus tierras.
If this happens, this would be a very devastating message to the rest of the victims in Colombia that are trying to get their lands restituted.
Así las cosas, solicitamos al Honorable Congreso de los Estados Unidos continuar con el monitoreo para asegurar que el proceso de restitución de tierras en Colombia sea transparente y se restituya de manera efectiva a sus legítimos propietarios.
So therefore, we urge the U.S. Congress to continue to monitor the land restitution process in Colombia to guarantee that the process is transparent and efficient and that the legitimate owners of lands are restituted their lands.
En el caso específico de Curvarado que les he presentado hoy, solicitamos además que el General Accounting Office realice un informe independiente sobre el proceso de restitución de tierras en Curvarado y Higuamiandot y la situación de seguridad de líderes y comunidades, de líderes de estas comunidades y las organizaciones que los acompañan.
And also, we ask in the specific case of the Curvado and Higuamiando community that the U.S. Congress ask the GAO to do an independent assessment of the land restitution process in this case, as well as the situation of security for the community leaders and those who accompany the process.
Y que inste al gobierno colombiano garantizar la participación efectiva de todas las comunidades en el proceso de restitución.
And that urge the Colombian government to guarantee that there's participation of all of the victims in this process of restitution.
En nombre de las comunidades de Curvarado y Higuamiandó por las que hablo hoy, agradezco pues esta oportunidad.
So in name of the communities of Higuamiando and Curvado with whom I represent today, I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tegan?
Buen día a todos y todas. Agradecimiento a la Comisión Tom Lantos de Derechos Humanos del Congreso, en especial pues, a los congresistas McGovern, a la señora Bonamici, también al congresista Frank Wolf, por su trabajo en Colombia y también por la organización de esta audiencia y la invitación que nos hacen a rendir el testimonio.
So good morning, and I would like to first thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for realizing this hearing. I would like to thank Congressman McGovern, Congresswoman Bonamici, Congressman Wolf, and especially want to thank all of you for the attention that you've paid to Colombia.
Quisiéramos empezar este testimonio con una pregunta que nos hemos hecho y que nos ha llevado a formular una propuesta para el proceso de paz del que se habla hoy en Colombia. La pregunta es, si se llegase a un acuerdo de negociación de terminación del conflicto armado entre las guerrillas y el gobierno colombiano, ¿terminarían las violaciones a derechos humanos en Colombia?
So I would like to start off my testimony by raising a question that is related to what has been discussed about the peace process in Colombia. Basically, if we are able to get a political accord to end the conflict between the government and the FARC, will the human rights violations in Colombia actually end?
La respuesta a la que nosotros ya hemos llegado es que no. No es suficiente un acuerdo de terminación del conflicto armado, no es suficiente una desmovilización de las guerrillas para terminar con las violaciones a derechos humanos en Colombia. Nosotros creemos que es necesario adelantar propuestas paralelas de construcción de garantías de no repetición muy sólidas que permitan la consolidación de la paz, propuestas de verdad, y consideramos que no puede haber paz basada en la impunidad.
And our response would be no, it's not sufficient just to have an agreement that ends the conflict. What you need is a parallel set of proposals that basically guarantee that there's non-repetition to these violations. In order to guarantee the peace, you also need to guarantee that there is truth in order to make sure that the situation will improve.
El colectivo de abogados Salvedad Restrepo ha venido discutiendo, construyendo una propuesta que incluye 3 elementos. La primera, la construcción de garantías de no repetición. La segunda, un tribunal de justicia para la paz. Y la tercera, una comisión de la verdad sobre los crímenes cometidos en Colombia en los últimos 50 años.
So the CAJAR, the organization that I represent, has come up with a proposal that is basically based on 3 different elements. Basically, first is to construct guarantees of non-repetition. Second, that there be a tribunal to deal with the human rights violations. And third, that there be a truth commission set up.
En cuanto a lo primero, las garantías de no repetición, nosotros consideramos que es importante discutir el desmonte de las estructuras paramilitares, el real desmonte. En segundo lugar, la depuración de las instituciones del Estado. En tercer lugar, el fortalecimiento de las instituciones encargadas de la investigación, de la protección de los derechos humanos, de la veeduría de los derechos humanos, pero también se requieren transformaciones económicas, tributarias, políticas y sociales profundas que solamente pueden lograrse a través de reformas estructurales.
So we think that in order to guarantee non-repetition, that there needs to be an effective dismantlement of paramilitarism through investigation and through effective sanctions for the perpetrators. We also believe that there needs to be a purging of the armed forces and of the state organizations that leads to the destitution immediately of officials that are linked to human rights violations. And also, we think that there needs to be a major transformation structurally in terms of economically and through tribunals in order to guarantee a profound transformation.
Algunas de las propuestas que se han formulado por parte del movimiento de víctimas de crímenes de Estado y que nosotros compartimos tienen que ver con, y que hemos mencionado en el pasado, tienen que ver con la depuración y desclasificación de archivos de inteligencia en los que se consignan actividades legales de defensores de derechos humanos, miembros de la oposición política, líderes sociales, en primer lugar. En segundo lugar, la depuración de las Fuerzas Armadas y de otras instituciones del Estado que han estado comprometidas con violaciones a derechos humanos. El desmonte efectivo del paramilitarismo con énfasis en aquellas estructuras políticas que se han financiado, pero también las económicas que se han beneficiado de sus acciones.
So we believe having worked hand in hand with the victims of the crimes against humanity, that what is needed is basically to purge all of the intelligence archives, especially those that relate to social leaders and others. We also think that there needs to be a purging of the armed forces, and especially those who have members that have been linked to human rights violations, and a complete dismantlement of the paramilitary structures at the political and the economic level.
Igualmente, es importante que se revisen los manuales, reglamentos, doctrina al interior de las Fuerzas Armadas que conciben a líderes sociales como el enemigo interno. También la remoción de conceptos como guerra jurídica, en el que organizaciones de derechos humanos, jueces y víctimas son concebidos como enemigos de las Fuerzas Armadas y del Estado.
So we think that there needs to be basically an examination, investigation to manuals, doctrines, and other forms that make social leaders considered to be enemies. We also think that there needs to be an end to the judicial wars against those considered to be enemies.
Es importante que se adopten mecanismos de control y procedimientos que reglamenten el uso de la fuerza pública durante manifestaciones sociales, así como que se reduzca el gasto militar y la proporción de pueda emplearse para la satisfacción de derechos económicos, sociales y culturales.
So we believe that there needs to be a mechanism that monitors and regulates the use of force during use of force during public protests. Also, we believe that there needs to be a reduction of the funding that goes to military operations and an upping of the funding that goes to economic and social programs.
Es importante considerar la reforma a estructuras y mecanismos tributarios, estructuras económicas que están favoreciendo la injusticia social, asimismo que puedan adoptarse formas de protección y desarrollo de la economía campesina e indígena.
So we think that there needs to be some reforms in terms of tribunals and economic structures that favor injustice in the country, as well as there needs to be more investment to develop different sustainable economies, especially of the rural population and indigenous people.
En segundo lugar, consideramos que no es posible consolidar la paz sobre la base de la impunidad. Por eso, creemos que es importante promover fórmulas de justicia que tiendan a propiciar garantías de no repetición y el más alto grado de verdad posible para las víctimas.
So we think that it's not possible to construct a sustainable peace unless you combat impunity. And so you need to put in place different formulas that not only lead to non-repetition of actions, but also guarantee the maximum amount of truth possible.
Proponemos la creación de un tribunal de justicia para la paz, al que se sometan todos aquellos actores, incluyendo miembros de las Fuerzas Armadas, miembros de la guerrilla, grupos paramilitares e incluso otros actores que han participado de alguna manera alimentando el conflicto armado para que reciban beneficios a cambio de verdad, aporte a garantías de no repetición y aporte a la consolidación de la paz.
We believe that our proposal is that there be a creation of a tribunal for justice and peace that includes all of the actors concerned in the conflict, so guerrillas, armed forces, paramilitaries, and also other sectors that have fueled or benefited from the conflict.
Proponemos que este tribunal sea de naturaleza confesional, que tenga dos salas, una sala sobre violaciones a derechos humanos, otra sala sobre infracciones al derecho internacional humanitario y que adicionalmente existan tratamientos punitivos diferenciados tratándose de una y otro tipo de violaciones, entendiendo que para nosotros las violaciones a derechos humanos cometidas por el Estado son más graves por su posición de garante.
We propose that this tribunal take a confessional approach. Basically, it looks at two different types of infractions. One would be human rights abuses, another would be international humanitarian law infractions, and that there exist a different gradients of sanctions for different sorts of violations committed. However, within that, the violations committed by the state need to be weighed more heavily, given that the state has an obligation to guarantee human rights.
En el caso de las guerrillas, debe tenerse un concepto que permita el otorgamiento de amnistías sobre delitos políticos, que se excluya de manera clara la comisión de crímenes de guerra y que, en todo caso, ningún mecanismo de beneficios ofenda la dignidad de las víctimas.
In the case of the guerrilla groups, we believe that there needs to be some kind of a concept that allows that there be amnesty with some of the political crimes, crimes committed within the war context. However, this needs to be weighed against a mechanism that doesn't offend the rights of victims.
Finalmente, debe quedar claro que aquellos miembros de grupos armados que no contribuyan efectivamente a la paz, que no cumplan los compromisos adquiridos, deberán ser juzgados por la justicia ordinaria o, en su defecto, debe quedar claro que serán sometidos a la Corte Penal Internacional.
And it should become very clear that members of groups, of armed groups that don't contribute to peace should or be judged in the ordinary mechanism or should be subjected to the International Criminal Court in the future.
Finalmente, creemos que la manera para propiciar el más alto grado de verdad posible es trabajar como se ha hecho en otros países que han tenido la posibilidad de terminar conflictos armados en una comisión de la verdad que justamente identifique todas las violaciones a derechos humanos que se cometieron desde 1945, haciendo énfasis en patrones de comisión de estas violaciones, así como recomendaciones para superar estas violaciones.
Lastly, we think that the best way to get the highest amount of truth in this situation is to follow the example of other countries that have terminated armed conflicts, and that is with the creation of a truth commission that looks at all of the violations that have taken place since 1945, what sort of trends or mechanisms existed throughout this period, and then recommendations to rectify those situations.
Para finalizar, agradecer nuevamente la posibilidad de haber rendido este testimonio y solicitarles, como lo han venido haciendo, que sigan contribuyendo a la paz y a la justicia en Colombia. Muchas gracias.
So in closing, I would like to thank you again for this opportunity and urge you to continue to work for contributing to peace and for justice in Colombia.
Well, thank you all for your excellent testimony. I want to thank Jimena Sanchez from WOLA for her unbelievable translation. And my colleague has a previous appointment, so I'm going to yield to her first for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to start with Ms. Drake. You talked about Law 1610, which was really designed to provide a clear path through which employers could directly hire employees and avoid the fines and sanctions. But obviously, according to your testimony, this is not working as planned. And what do you think would need to be changed to make that law effective?
Thank you very much. We have some specific criticisms of Resolution 321, which puts Law 1610 into practice. So, and these include the fact that under the law, the labor inspector cannot decide on controversies, and controversies aren't really well defined under the law. So an employer can sort of stop up the process by saying, well, this is a controversy that we have here, rather than saying it's actually clear that we were illegally using cooperatives or other forms of labor intermediation. Secondly, there's no provision at all for union worker participation in the creation of the formalization accords. So you have events like the one that I talked about in my testimony, where this formalization accord just appears, and the workers who were working so hard to get the recognition that they were being illegally subcontracted and get the attention of the labor ministry are now shocked to find out that 45 of them have been formalized when there were really 600 workers that were supposed to be affected. And there's really no process under the law for a follow-up provision to make sure that the elements of the accord are being followed. And, you know, in addition to that, it really requires training and clear training for all of the labor inspectors who were involved in creating the formalization accords. There's been local labor inspectors who have said to the workers that virtually any kind of civil, commercial, labor subcontracting organization all will count as labor formalization, including SOS, under Law 1610. Well, that's, you know, completely contrary to the point of the law. And if that's what the Ministry of Labor employees who are charged with enforcing the law believe, and then that's what they produce in their formalization accords, the workers are no better off. They've put in the time and risked their lives and livelihoods to accomplish something, and then they end up with either the exact same situation or marginal improvements to where they were before. So it's the goal was good, but there really do need to be a lot of very serious changes in the law itself and its implementation.
Thank you very much. It was an excellent summary, and I trust that you're communicating all of that to the relevant people who can make those changes. Mr. Schoening, you, in your testimony, talk about the what seems to be a pretty pathetic prosecutorial background here with regard to the cases. I think you said that there have been only 28 cases out of the 17,000 open investigations. Only 28 had led to a conviction. And I know our other witnesses talked about some of the problems with the tribunals, but do you have any other explanation for why that record is so really slim in terms of all of the cases have only resulted in 28 convictions?
Yes, the record for investigations of forced displacement isn't very impressive. I mean, impunity is a problem that affects all different types of human rights violations in Colombia. Part of this, I think, is a matter of will on the part of the prosecutor's office to go after the really hard cases and touch very powerful interests on a local level. While there are many justice officials who are extremely committed, there's sometimes, I think, a lack of will to go after some of the tougher cases. Part of it's strategy as well. There's a lack of coordination in the prosecutor. There has been a lack of coordination in the prosecutor's office, so cases related to the same region and communities and armed actors could be handled by maybe 3 or 4 different prosecutors. So instead of grouping the cases under one prosecutor for the same perpetrator in the same region in order to identify patterns, the cases have been spread out, and that doesn't yield the results that need to happen.
Thank you very much. And then I wanted to ask Ms. Avila, did I say that correctly? I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what are some of the reasons for the lack of institutional attention to the plight of the indigenous people and the Afro-Colombians?
Bueno, creo que la legislación colombiana reconoce derechos a comunidades indígenas y afros, pero ese reconocimiento en la práctica no se desarrolla de la mejor manera. Y esto responde a que en muchas ocasiones esos derechos de los indígenas y de los afros son reemplazados o son puestos en un lugar más abajo de los derechos y pues de los proyectos económicos. Hay una relación íntima entre las violaciones a derechos humanos cometidas en contra de afros indígenas y la implementación de proyectos de infraestructura, de proyectos de explotación minera, de proyectos de explotación petrolera, y eso genera graves vulneraciones a los derechos. Entonces, esa falta de coordinación entre esos dos aspectos es lo que genera mayor vulneración de los derechos de esas comunidades.
Colombian legislation for Afro-Colombian indigenous people. Is that? Okay. The legislation that exists in Colombia for Afro-Colombian indigenous people recognizes an ample set of rights. However, in practice, these rights are not well implemented. What we see is that often the rights of economic projects or economic interests are given a higher standing than the rights of the Afro-Colombian indigenous people. And we see that in many cases, when it comes to infrastructure projects, mining, oil, extractive industries, there is basically that beneficiary of their rights over the rights of the Afro-Colombian indigenous. And what we see is a lack of coordination between basically these two aspects. And this leads to a vulnerability of risk of violations against Afro-Colombian indigenous.
Thank you. And Ms. Ortegon, I wanted to ask you, do you have a reaction to the Constitutional Court's decision to strike down the constitutional amendment to expand military jurisdiction? We talked about that earlier.
la decisión de la Corte.
Es sin duda una decisión muy importante. La reforma al fuero penal militar que se aprobó en diciembre del año pasado y la ley estatutaria que se aprobó en junio de este año es para nosotros uno de los retrocesos más grandes en los últimos 30 años en materia de justicia frente a violaciones a derechos humanos. La decisión de la Corte Constitucional es sin duda una respuesta a esa necesidad de justicia frente a las violaciones de derechos humanos. Y aunque las razones fueron de forma, la Corte Constitucional sabe que, y así lo manifestó también, que tiene implicaciones profundas en materia de los derechos de las víctimas. Creemos que además en parte la decisión que toma la Corte Constitucional es en respuesta a diferentes manifestaciones de la comunidad internacional preocupadas por esta ampliación. Entonces, de paso también agradecer el trabajo que se hizo desde acá, también desde las organizaciones de la sociedad civil estadounidense que nos dieron un apoyo fuerte para manifestar las preocupaciones frente a esta reforma sin duda muy grave. Adicionalmente, este debe ser un punto fundamental en las garantías de no repetición. La reducción cada vez más fuerte del fuero militar como mecanismo excepcional frente a violaciones, excepcional frente a la aplicación de justicia y siempre restrictivo, circunscrito a delitos militares y nunca aplicable a violaciones a derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
We think that this is an important decision because it basically refers to military reforms and a statutory law that we, from our perspective, saw as a step backwards in human rights violations. Basically, it would be going back 30 years in what's been achieved in terms of protection of human rights in Colombia, while the Constitutional Court's response and reasons given for this decision are really procedural. We know that the Constitutional Court, and they've said it themselves, sees that their decision will have an important implication on what it means in terms of rights of victims. We think that the Constitutional Court's decision is also comes from a response by the international community and many others of concern about these reforms, and we wish to take this opportunity to thank the U.S. Congress and U.S. civil society organizations for helping us elevate our concerns at the international level in terms of our grave concerns about this reform. It's very important to emphasize that in order to guarantee non-repetition, there needs to be a further steps to guarantee that there isn't this amplification of such reforms. They need to be very restrictive to guarantee that there isn't impunity.
Thank you. And if I may, just one more question. Thank you. And this is to both Ms. Avila and Ms. Ortegon. Earlier, when Dr. Bouvier was testifying, we talked about the youth in Colombia and the next generation. And here in the U.S. Congress, I serve on the Education Committee, and I'm very concerned about child welfare issues. And so when I learned that so many of the fighters in Colombia are just teenagers, I wondered if you could comment, both of you, on really the hope, if any, in the next generation, and how do you sense the attitude among the youth now that there are these peace talks going on? Are they optimistic, or have they grown up with so much violence that they can't see the hope and optimism? Thank you.
Bueno, ciertamente el conflicto armado en las comunidades indígenas y afrocolombianas han afectado de manera grave pues la vida de las mujeres, los niños y los jóvenes.
So it is very true that the internal conflict in Colombia has deeply affected the lives of indigenous and Afro-Colombian women, children, and youth.
Muchas personas han tenido que salir de sus territorios y ahora viven en ciudades en total desconexión con lo que era su vida antes del desplazamiento.
And many people have, as a result, been forced to flee their territories and live in urban settings where they're living basically in a complete disconnect through what was their prior life before the displacement.
Pero también muchas comunidades han logrado establecerse en sus territorios, crear mecanismos a partir de la música, del arte, del teatro para resistir en ellos.
But we've also seen at the same time that many communities have reestablished themselves in their territory and engaged in a process of resistance of displacement, utilizing music, art, and other forms.
Y esas son iniciativas importantísimas que deben ser seguidas y apoyadas
These are very important initiatives that need to be not just monitored, but supported.
para lograr que estas generaciones se asienten en sus territorios, puedan seguir disfrutando de ellos y puedan contribuir a la paz y a la reconciliación de Colombia.
And these are initiatives that need that support because basically this will help guarantee that these generations that are still in their territories can remain in their territories and contribute to peace and justice in the country.
Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Es una pregunta muy difícil porque los jóvenes en Colombia no saben lo que es vivir sin conflicto armado. Todos los jóvenes nacieron viviendo el conflicto armado, lo han sufrido y creo que pues, no se imaginan una realidad diferente. Por eso este momento es tan importante, porque puede ser la esperanza de que otra realidad es posible y una de las consecuencias también muy importantes del conflicto armado en las juventudes es el temor permanente, pero también que ha conducido a una despolitización de las juventudes, ha conducido también a una reducción de los espacios sociales. Muchos jóvenes no tienen posibilidades económicas diferentes de la de reclutarse en algún grupo, el ejército, la guerrilla, los paramilitares. Entonces, este proceso debe permitir eso, debe permitir generar esperanza, debe permitir generar nuevas oportunidades sociales diferentes al pertenecer a un grupo armado, debe permitir a los jóvenes recuperar sus espacios políticos y sociales, debe permitirles también sus propios espacios, su propia voz y debe permitir imaginarse un país diferente.
I think that this is a very difficult question that you are asking because the majority, well, the youth in Colombia only knows really the internal conflict, and many of them have suffered as a result. They don't know what it's like to live without that conflict. However, this is a very important opportunity for hope to make the reality very different. One of the things that you see among the youth is a constant fear that they live under. We've seen a depolitization of the youth. We've seen that their social spaces have decreased. We've seen that basically in order to survive, most of the youth see the only option as recruitment by one of the groups, either the armed forces, the paramilitaries, or the guerrillas. So in order to generate hope, it's very important that they're no longer part of these groups, that they can recuperate some of their social and political spaces, basically that their values can be changed so that you have a situation where a different reality is possible.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for yielding and for holding this.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your questions and I appreciate all your answers. I just got a few more, if you don't mind. I know you've been sitting here a long time, but Ms. Drake, I want you to know that when I was last in Colombia, we did meet with the port workers in Buenaventura, and I think I echo everything you said. I mean, it's a serious situation. Let me ask you, do you find the U.S. government's response to threats and violence against Colombian unions and labor activists, I mean, how do you find the U.S., how do you find our government's response to what is going on down there? I mean, specifically, are they responsive? Do they follow through and actively pressure the government of Colombia to investigate and prosecute? Should they be doing more?
I mean, I think the U.S. government has a good team that I deal with at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and the Department of Labor that follow the issues of the Labor Action Plan, but I really do think they could be doing much more specifically with reference to the threats and violence and impunity. You know, as the very first witness that you spoke to admitted, there hasn't been one conviction of a murder of a trade unionist in the last 2 years. Well, that's significant because that was a large point in the Labor Action Plan, and the way to deter these future threats and acts of violence is to make sure that there is going to be swift and certain justice, and that it's not just the material authors of the crimes, but the intellectual authors, and really finding out what's going on there. And I think, you know, we report when we hear that there are threats, when there are threats publicized, we contact the U.S. government and we say, you know, please make sure that in your very next conversation with your counterparts in the government of Colombia, that you raise this issue, that you ask for a report back on the issue. You know, are the workers who were threatened receiving immediate protection plans? If it's the case of a murder or an assault, then, you know, we ask for information on what's happening with the investigation. And all too often, we unfortunately don't hear back from the U.S. government on what's the status of the inquiries that we've made. And I do understand that they're quite busy in covering a number of issues. But what we do hear from the workers much too often is that they don't think there's any investigation happening at all, that they haven't been, the word of Juan Carlos Perez Munoz at the La Cabana plantation, his union reports they haven't been interviewed about the murder, and that just calls into question what's happening. Are these promises about threats and violence real promises and real changes, or is it a lot of promises on paper to look good and there's not enough follow-through? And we think the U.S. government could be more forceful in really encouraging and urging and ensuring follow-through.
And just for the record, how do you view the roles played by the ILO, ENS, and the Solidarity Center in Colombia? You know, should the United States government continue to provide support for them?
The U.S. government should continue to provide robust and strong support for them. These institutions are really the institutions that the workers rely on for good information, to train the workers in what their labor rights are, for the ILO for technical advice, for the ENS for just great compilation of accurate and reliable data, as accurate as possible, you know, when workers are afraid to report these crimes sometimes. But these are organizations that really ought to be supported, and if they weren't there, however bad the situation is for workers in Colombia, it would be much, much worse.
Thank you. Mr. Schoening, the report that you released last month revealed that 2 years since the Victims' Law was enacted, only 3 displaced families had returned to live on their land as a result of court rulings under the law. Taking into account that millions of Colombians have been forcibly displaced, those aren't particularly impressive numbers. How did the government respond to your findings?
Well, in terms of the security issue, the government recognized that frequent threats against land claimants are a serious problem. In terms of the poor results in implementing the Victims' Law, the government attempted to downplay our findings by claiming that hundreds of families had returned to their land thanks to the law. Right. But the hundreds of families that had returned to the land that were cited by the government are in fact cases of people who returned years ago, essentially cases of people who returned years ago by their own means, and were then able to use the law to get their land titles, to formalize their ownership of the land. While it's important to provide land titles to people, that's not the purpose of the law. The major purpose of the law is to allow the millions of displaced Colombians who continue to remain away from their homes, who continue to be displaced, and allow those Colombians to return to live on their land. And unfortunately, by September 2013, the government could confirm just 3 cases of families who had been able to transition from the condition of being displaced to returning to live on their land thanks to the law.
So, just one final question: how do we remedy this? I mean, what should the Colombian government be doing better, and what can the United States government be doing to actually support these claimants and being, and ensuring their security and ensuring that the law is implemented in the spirit in which it was supposedly put together?
Well, one of the main obstacles here is security. So, as lots of the witnesses have touched on, paramilitary groups and associated criminal mafias continue to have a strong influence in many regions of Colombia. So, in order to make land restitution work, it's going to be vital to really curb the power of these groups and dismantle them where the government wants to implement land restitution. Another issue is a matter of strategy. So which cases the government focuses on. I think that one option, and a good option, would be for the Land Restitution Office to focus its efforts on cases where displaced people have not been able to return, and use that mechanism to allow displaced people to return to their land, and allow other government institutions that already exist to provide land titles to people who have already returned to their land. I think that would be a probably more efficient strategy. And the U.S. government, I think, can play a crucial role here in urging Colombia to prosecute the perpetrators of these threats and attacks, providing the Attorney General's office with sufficient resources and assistance that it needs to make greater progress in bringing perpetrators to justice. And also in terms of providing housing to displaced people who have benefited from the law, to ensure that they don't just receive a land title and then can't return because their home is now in shambles and they don't have a place to live. So there's lots of ways.
No, and I think, and again, I think it's an important point, because, if you're going to negotiate a peace agreement and you're going to ask people to lay down their arms and to trust the institutions to provide them protection and to help them transition into into civilian society. The lack of implementation of some of these laws could complicate things. I mean, it doesn't build up a lot of trust, and so I agree with you. I think we need to figure out ways to make sure that we guarantee people's security. Although, having said that, when we were down there, when I was down there with George Miller, we met with human rights advocates and defenders, and labor activists and defenders, and people who were, advocating for land rights, and they all had, armored cars and bodyguards. And I think at some point there's a limit to how many bodyguards and armed cars you can provide people. At some point you have to start, breaking the back of impunity and going after, some of these, criminal gangs and paramilitaries and, corrupt individuals, some of them who are locally elected officials, and demonstrate the commitment of the national government, to deal with the issue of impunity and actually make sure these laws are implemented. So I think this is a very important issue. Ms. Avila, members of your organization have received threats and experienced violent attacks, and as some members of Congress have actually kind of intervened on behalf of some of your members. What are some of the sources of your protection? Do you receive any protection from the national government? And just one final question: to your knowledge, have Afro-Colombian or indigenous issues been specifically discussed at the peace talks?
Entonces, dos preguntas. Una es, ¿qué tipo de protección han recibido ustedes? Y segundo es, el tema de afrocolombianos e indígenas. Ellos han participado en el proceso de paz y los temas.
Bueno, la organización de la que hago parte pues ha recibido varias amenazas. A partir de ellas, varias organizaciones de derechos humanos y el Congreso de los Estados Unidos ha manifestado su preocupación al gobierno colombiano por esta situación, y a raíz de ella pues ha habido algunos avances en materia de medidas materiales. Sin embargo, lo cierto es que siempre hemos señalado que es el desmantelamiento de las estructuras que han usurpado las tierras en las comunidades que acompañamos, la mejor medida de protección para el desarrollo de nuestra labor.
So my organization, like you said, has received multiple death threats, and it's really thanks to the pronouncements by human rights organizations and members of the U.S. Congress with the Colombian government that we've seen some advancement in terms of getting some protective measures in terms of material terms. However, one thing we wish to emphasize that if you really want to get at the heart of this, that you need to figure out a way to dismantle the structures that basically lead to these organizations to be in the territories that lead to the threats.
En nuestros diálogos con el gobierno nacional hemos insistido en que más allá de los carros o las medidas de protección material, necesitamos avances efectivos en las investigaciones para desmantelar todas las estructuras criminales que están detrás de las amenazas y que creemos están también favoreciendo el despojo de tierras de las comunidades.
What we have stated to the Colombian government on several occasions is that more than cars and material protection support, what we really need is an effective way of dismantling the criminal structures that are behind these groups that generate these death threats and that have usurped lands.
Y respecto a la segunda pregunta, en efecto, varias comunidades indígenas y afrocolombianas han realizado propuestas de paz específicas frente a cómo debería ser manejado su territorio y qué medidas de reparación y medidas de garantías de no repetición deben implementarse para construir la paz en todos estos territorios. Varias de estas propuestas también han sido presentadas al gobierno nacional y muchas han sido llevadas a La Habana pues con la idea de que este diálogo y esta construcción pueda favorecer los diálogos de paz y pueda traducirse en medidas efectivas para estas comunidades.
With regard to the second question, various Afro-Colombian indigenous communities have formulated different proposals for how to basically have an effective reparation in their territories as well as non-repetition of events. Many of these proposals have been taken to the national government. They've also been presented to Havana, to those who are negotiating. And basically, the purpose of that was to inform the dialogue so that the kinds of decisions are made are the most effective in order to guarantee the rights of African indigenous people.
Well, I just would say that I think it's important that when talking about a negotiation and talking about peace and reconciliation, that it's understood that there are more than two players involved. It's more than just the state and the FARC or ELN. I mean, there are lots of other groups that have been adversely impacted by the war, that have suffered greatly, who ought to have a say in the future of the country. And so I hope that some of these proposals actually get serious consideration at the negotiating table. And finally, to Ms. Ortega, one of the important obstacles to the successful transitional justice efforts is the population's lack of trust in its national institutions. And we've talked a lot about that at this hearing. Is such distrust prevalent in Colombia, and if so, how can it be overcome? And just how would you describe the optimal balance between delivering justice for all victims and peace? Two easy questions.
Bueno, y muchísimas gracias por las preguntas, muy interesantes. Sobre la primera pregunta, quisiera ilustrar mi respuesta con un ejemplo conocido, y es el caso del Departamento Administrativo de Seguridad DAS. Se ha hablado del desmonte del DAS. Para nosotros ocurrió un cambio de nombre, una nueva agencia, pero nunca se le dijo al país qué pasó con el DAS. nosotros tenemos documentados casos de violaciones a derechos humanos cometidos por el DAS, consistentes en detenciones arbitrarias, torturas, ejecuciones extrajudiciales, algunas de ellas conocidas por la Comisión Interamericana. En la década del 2000, casos de crímenes cometidos por el DAS en asocio con paramilitares, algunos de ellos han sido conocidos también por la justicia colombiana, toda la persecución del DAS a los más altos niveles de congresistas, miembros de cortes, defensores de derechos humanos, y graves violaciones a derechos humanos, incluyendo asesinatos contra sindicalistas cometidos por el DAS. Se cambió el nombre del DAS y el país no supo qué pasó con el DAS. Los anteriores integrantes del DAS pasaron unos a la Fiscalía, otros a la Unidad Nacional de Protección y hace un par de semanas el exdirector del DAS se declaró la prescripción de algunas de las conductas por las cuales estaba siendo investigado. Entonces, en el caso del DAS nunca hubo justicia, nunca hubo verdad para la sociedad colombiana. En suma, digamos, este ejemplo sirve para mostrar cuál es uno de los problemas que genera desconfianza en las instituciones.
Well, I would like to thank you for this question, and I would like to, the first question, and I would like to answer it basically with illustrating a case that I think answers it well, which is the case of the DAS. Basically, there's been a dismantling of the DAS, but however, this dismantling was really just a change in name and a change in agency. Actually, the country itself doesn't know fully what the DAS was engaged in. It was engaged in arbitrary detentions and extrajudicial executions. There have been several cases presented in front of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of these cases. In the decades of the 2000s, there were so many crimes committed by the DAS, including crimes where there was collusion with paramilitaries, and some of those cases even came to the justice system. There was also an ample persecution of members of the political opposition, of magistrates, of human rights defenders, and there was direct engagement in violations such as the killings of trade unionists. So basically, you've had this change in the DAS, but the country doesn't know what happened to some of the officials that worked for the DAS. We know that some are working for the National Protection Unit, some are working for the Fiscalía. We know that the former director of the DAS is still far from being completely brought to justice. So we've seen that there has been this justice, but there's been no real truth of explaining to the society what has happened, and I think that that's part of the problems we will be confronting.
Y ejercicio similar se podría hacer con varias instituciones, empezando por el Ejército Nacional. Entonces, la respuesta tiene que ser depurar esas instituciones. Todos los miembros, todos los funcionarios públicos implicados en violaciones a derechos humanos deben ser destituidos. Se debe crear una nueva institucionalidad. En el Congreso de la República no podrían existir congresistas vinculados con el paramilitarismo. Sus partidos deben ser sancionados de alguna forma para que se transmita el mensaje de que eso no es permitido, que eso no es, digamos, no es coincidente con la necesidad de una sociedad democrática. Deberían fortalecerse instituciones como la Fiscalía. En estos días un exfiscal general está siendo investigado por vínculos con grupos paramilitares, por favorecer el crimen. Digamos, este tipo de acciones no deberían repetirse. Entonces, la manera es fortalecer las instituciones civiles sobre las militares, investigar adecuadamente todos los crímenes, pero sobre todo a los máximos responsables. No es posible que, y volviendo al tema de la juventud, no es posible que la juventud tenga esos referentes de política, de héroes, que son básicamente pues, criminales que nunca fueron investigados.
What I just described about the DAS, you can basically look at different institutions within Colombia and look at the same thing. So if we look at the armed forces, for example, really needs to have a very strong response where there's a purging of those folks who have links to criminal groups and so forth. In the case of the Colombian Congress, the political parties need to be sanctioned so that there is a guarantee that it will not be allowed in the future for any of its members to have links to criminal or other groups, that is the way that a democratic society should operate. For example, there needs to be also a strengthening of the Attorney General's office. Right now, the former Attorney General is being investigated for links to paramilitaries. So I would say that the formula is that you need to have civilian oversight over military institution. You have to have the maximum response possible in terms of justice, so that youth in Colombia, going back to the previous question, refer to their heroes in the society, not as folks that have been engaged in criminal activity, but those who act differently.
Well, thank you all very, very much. Again, I want to thank Katya Migacheva. I want to thank J.P. Schuster, Cindy Buell, who's my legislative director, who traveled with me to Colombia. And I want to thank all of the witnesses here. I want to thank you for what you do, for defending human rights, and this has been very, very informative. You know, I'm a hopeful kind of person, and I believe that some of the challenges that have been laid out here will ultimately be worked out, and that is good for all Colombians. And so we will continue to monitor the human rights situation. Continue to pressure the Colombian government when necessary, continue to pressure the U.S. government when necessary, send the appropriate messages to the FARC when necessary, but we will continue to monitor the situation, and I want to thank all of you for being here, and the hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.